Okay, picture one of the most remote islands on the entire planet. A tiny volcanic rock, basically, rising out of the middle of the Pacific, thousands of miles from, well, from anywhere. It really should be paradise, right? But for the small group of people who landed there, it became a private hell. It was like a real-life experiment in what happens when society just completely falls apart. This is a story of how a desperate hunt for freedom went spiraling down into a decade of absolute murder and madness.
So let that sink in for a second. That's the brutal bottom line of what we're talking about today. You have 15 men, a mix of British sailors and Tahitian natives who set out to build a brand new world. But within just 10 years, 14 of them were dead. And not from disease or some accident, but at each other's hands. So how on earth did a dream of utopia turn into a decade-long nightmare?
To really understand how this remote island became such a bloodbath, we have to rewind a bit. Because our story doesn't start on the island. Nope. It starts out on the high seas, with one of the most famous rebellions in all of naval history, the mutiny on the HMS Bounty. So after Fletcher Christian and his crew seized the ship from the infamous Captain Bligh, they knew they were in deep trouble. The British Navy would hunt them to the ends of the earth. They had to disappear, completely. And they found their sanctuary on Pitcairn, an island so isolated it was actually misplaced on the official naval charts. To make absolutely sure they'd never be found, they ran the Bounty aground and set her on fire. It was this huge, dramatic act, severing every last tie with the world they knew. They were ghosts now, and Pitcairn was their new reality.
So let's break down who we're talking about here. This was the initial group. You've got 9 British mutineers, with Fletcher Christian as their leader. They also brought along 6 Tahitian men and 12 Tahitian women. So that's 27 people in total, about to create a brand new society completely from scratch, totally cut off from the rest of the world, and, more importantly, all of its laws.
You'd think the goal here was freedom, right? A fresh start. Well, the reality was anything but, because the paradise they were trying to build, it was basically rotten from the very start, and the cracks in their so-called utopia started to show almost immediately.
Okay, let's get into this, because this slide shows you the absolute core of the problem. A super rigid, two-tiered system was put in place from day one. The British mutineers saw themselves as the masters of the island. They carved up the land for themselves, they took the Tahitian women as their wives, and they kept control of all the muskets and tools they'd salvaged from the Bounty. But the Tahitian men, who hadn't joined as prisoners but as partners, they suddenly found themselves being treated as little more than slaves. This wasn't a society, it was a tiny, isolated tyranny. And we're not just talking about some minor disagreement here. This was total subjugation. The Tahitian men were denied wives and treated like property, forced to work for the mutineers. You have to imagine this claustrophobic, isolated place. Resentment was just festering, creating this powder keg of hatred that was just waiting for a spark.
And that spark, well, it came in liquid form. One of the mutineers, a Scotsman named William McCoy, he figured out how to use a copper boiler from the Bounty to distill this really potent alcohol from a local plant. And pretty soon, alcoholism just gripped this tiny community, fueling paranoia, jealousy, and these insane, violent outbursts. That already fragile social order didn't just bend, it completely shattered.
So, you can see where this is going, right? All the pieces were in place for an absolute catastrophe. What happens next isn't just one single event. It's a horrifying chain reaction, as years of resentment, now supercharged with alcohol, finally explode into bloodshed.
So by 1793, about 3 years after they arrived, the island was a total pressure cooker. But, kinda miraculously, all 9 of the original British mutineers were still alive. That was about to change in a big way. This is where the killing really starts. The Tahitian men, stripped of their dignity, their rights, everything, they finally snapped. They launched this coordinated, bloody revolt, rising up and killing 5 of the mutineers, including their leader, Fletcher Christian. It was this brutal act of vengeance. But it didn't bring peace. No, it only unleashed more violence.
Now, what's really wild is just how fast everything collapsed. The violence didn't stop there. All of the Tahitian men were soon dead too, either killed by the surviving Englishmen or, in this shocking twist, killed by the Tahitian women who were getting revenge for their murdered partners. And just like that, with the original conflict resolved in the most brutal way possible, the survivors, well, they had no common enemy anymore, so they turned on each other.
The next few years just evolved into this blurry nightmare of paranoia and murder. One mutineer, Matthew Quintal, went completely mad from the drink, threatening to kill everyone's children. The last 2 men alive had to literally hunt him down and kill him with an axe. Another one, Edward Young, just ended up dying from his long-standing asthma. By the time the century turned, the island was just steeped in blood and distrust.
So by the year 1800, a full decade after they arrived looking for their utopia, this eerie silence fell over Pitcairn. The wave of violence had finally crashed, and what it left behind was just shocking.
And here it is, the astonishing result of their 10-year experiment in freedom. Out of the 15 men, 9 British, 6 Tahitian, who had landed on this island, only one was left alive. One man. The sole patriarch of a community of women and children who had known nothing but violence their entire lives.
And that man's name was John Adams. Originally, he was described as a reckless Jack, an illiterate London orphan. He was probably the least likely person you'd pick to become the founder of a new society. And yet the fate of every single person on that island now rested on his shoulders.
You have to imagine, Adams was absolutely haunted by what he'd been a part of, and he was terrified of what came next. He was plagued by these horrific nightmares and visions, convinced that he was damned for his role in the mutiny and all the massacres. This terror, this crushing weight of his own sins and the fear of hell, it sparked this profound, desperate religious conversion. And this shows his incredible transformation. Using the Bounty's Bible as his only guide, this mutineer became a patriarch. He taught himself, and then all the children had to read and write. He set up strict daily prayers and Sunday services, creating this rigid moral and social order where before there had been nothing but chaos. In this lawless land, he became the law. He was their judge, their priest, their teacher. They just called him Father.
And then, in 1808, the outside world finally stumbled upon Pitcairn again. When the American captain Mayhew Folger landed, he wasn't met with violence and chaos. He was met by a peaceful, devout, English-speaking Christian community. That hellscape from the 1790s was completely gone, replaced by what looked like a perfect model of Protestant virtue, all of it built from the ashes of a massacre by the last man standing.
The story of Pitcairn, it's like a shocking, real-world Lord of the Flies. It's this chilling natural experiment on the very nature of society itself. And it really forces us to ask, when you strip away civilization, laws, government, all of it, are we just destined to destroy each other? Or is that need for order, for rules, and for community so fundamental that it will eventually claw its way back, even in the most unlikely of hands?